This podcast features criminologists discussing sensitive themes and topics. Listener discretion is advised.
A woman's abusive husband kidnaps her children and threatens to kill her, but her traumatic experiences would turn her into a fierce advocate. This is the Mildred Muhammad story. Good morning, Meghan.
Oh, it's sure a good morning. No, it's not. But good morning anyway.
Oh, it's always a good morning when we're recording, so.
I know, but I will say I'm a little under it today.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I have a little bit of lack of sleep. I've got the whole congested head going on. So my apologies. I sound a little funky this morning.
I don't hear it, but I'll do my best to try to keep you engaged. Have you heard of Mildred?
No, I was looking actually at our, who we had up in the lineup today, because I was just inputting my script and whatnot, and I was like, who is this?
Yeah.
But then I thought, it's not surprising, because you always surprise me, or almost always surprise me with names that I have no clue who they are, so.
Well, while you probably haven't heard of Mildred's name, I can bet that you know the events surrounding this case.
Oh.
And Mildred is an important, often ignored person when people are talking about these events. I'll bet $1 million that you know the events that her name is involved in.
Better be ready to put your money where your mouth is, because I could use that money.
All right. Well, today we will focus on Mildred. So let's go ahead and meet her. Mildred was born in 1960 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She was the fourth girl in the family, and there was quite an age gap between her and her three older sisters. In fact, the largest gap was over 9 years. Other than the three sisters, she also had a younger brother. Mildred and her siblings lived with their mother, as their father wasn't in the picture very much. Actually, she barely knew him at all, and then he passed away when she was about 9 years old. She was told as a child that he died in the Navy, but she later found out that he died in a house fire that resulted from a domestic dispute. In other words, he was murdered by an abusive partner.
Wow, okay.
Growing up, Mildred's mom struggled to support her children, but they made it work the best they could, and she was a very loving mother. Mildred said she lived a pretty sheltered childhood and spent most of her time at church. She was a good student in high school and was on the cheerleading squad. Mildred managed 2.5 years at Southern University, where she studied computer science, but unfortunately, she had to drop out her junior year because she could no longer afford the college tuition.
Ugh.
She then moved on to technical school for data entry, and not long after finishing her certificate, she got a job working as a data processor for the State Department of Labor. In September of 1983, at the age of 23, Mildred met a man named John Muhammad while she was sitting in her friend's car outside of a local store. John had walked by with a friend of his, and he was immediately taken by Mildred, so he had stopped to talk to her. Mildred says there was an instant mutual attraction, and he had asked to take her to dinner that evening. And Mildred was pretty smitten early on. John had doted on her, and he seemed like such a good catch. He was lighthearted, he was fun, kind, romantic. Now, John was originally from New Orleans. He had 5 siblings, so like Mildred, he came from a large family, and his father also had been absent during his childhood. He would go on to tell Mildred that his mother had tragically died from breast cancer when he was just a few years old, and because of that, him and his siblings had to move in with extended family in Baton Rouge. That's what brought him to Louisiana.
Okay.
He went on to tell Mildred that these family members were mentally and physically abusive to him and to his siblings. But despite this traumatic childhood, John held a steady job, and he was a member of the National Guard. John also had 2 sons from a previous relationship, but as he told Mildred, he never got married. Mildred believed that he was an excellent match for her, and the two started planning their future together. However, while everything seemed to be going so well, Mildred found out from a friend that John had lied to her. He was, in fact, married to the mother of his 2 sons.
Wait, I had a feeling that was coming. Okay, I just want to say I thought something's going to happen here.
Do you recognize this name yet, by any chance?
No, I don't actually.
Okay, excellent.
No, it's a total surprise.
Good. Let's continue on.
Okay.
Mildred was very upset by this information and confronted John, but he said him and his son's mother were separated and that he only wanted to be with Mildred. But she was upset, she was lied to, and at this point she broke things off romantically.
Yeah, as most would do.
I think so.
Gosh.
The two of them stayed friends, and at one point, After John admitted to Mildred that he couldn't read, she ended up helping him learn to both read and write. And about 2 years later, while John was stationed in Fort Lewis, Washington, he sent Mildred a letter along with a one-way ticket to come live with him. Now, with so much time having passed between his lie about being married, it seemed that Mildred had forgiven John, and she accepted this invitation.
What year was that around? Or what time frame?
Mid-'80s.
Okay.
Mid to late 80s.
Thank you. It's actually, I'm asking because I'm trying to figure out who it is, so.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
You might not guess for a little while,
All right.
but please let me know when you do have an idea.
All right.
Don't give it away to the audience.
I'll let you know.
Okay.
All right.
So Mildred accepted this invitation, and she moved in with John on the military base where he worked as a combat engineer. So basically, he was an expert in arming and disarming explosives. Now, as it sounds, this was very dangerous work, but John was very committed, and he worked hard at moving up the ranks. John was mostly well-liked and respected, and Mildred was enjoying their life together at the base, where she began working in a data entry job and made friends with some of the other military wives and girlfriends. Things were going well for the couple, and they officially married in March of 1988. However, after legalizing their union, issues would start to emerge. Mildred said that John suddenly became manipulative and controlling. He was also having a lot of issues at work. He started going out a lot, and he was spending too much money. In the spring of 1989, Mildred found out that she was pregnant. And while this should have been good news, it was not good news for Mildred because at this time, she also found out that John was having a serious relationship with a much younger woman, a woman who, of course, did not know that John was married. Lots of red flags here.
Yeah, this sucks.
Yeah, but because of the pregnancy, Mildred decided she would stay with John, and she gave birth to a baby boy named John Jr. in January of 1990. But as we often see in these types of abusive marriages, the birth of their son did not save the marriage.
Right.
In fact, things only got worse as John was sent to the Persian Gulf to get ready to invade the Middle East. However, he was discharged due to a shoulder injury right before his deployment. But Mildred said that John's behavior just got worse and worse when he returned. To complicate things more, Mildred had become pregnant with their second child, and this child was born 9 months after John's failed deployment. All the while, John was becoming more controlling, more angry, more withdrawn, and he began verbally abusing Mildred.
This sounds like it's going somewhere very bad, but okay.
Yes. With 2 small children, Mildred desperately tried to make things work. But things would only get better for a short time before reverting back to abusive behaviors, as is the pattern, unfortunately. By the time their third child was born in 1993, John had become erratic and announced that he wanted to leave the military altogether. Now, this was very worrisome because they had 3 young children. And at this time, Mildred's elderly mother had moved in with them, and Mildred was laid off from her job. So I can't imagine how stressful the only person bringing in money in the family decides that they no longer want to be in the military. He had no plan at this time, but he was adamant that he was no longer interested in staying where he was.
And by your dates and calculations, she would have 3 children under the age of 5.
That is correct.
That is a challenge.
3 little children and an elderly mother that she was caring for.
Yeah, that's a lot.
So as I mentioned, John was adamant. It didn't seem that he cared about what Mildred had to say or the fact that he had to provide for this family. So John and his family moved off the base and they settled in Tacoma, Washington. And a little while after being there, John decided that he would start repairing cars. So they actually went into a family business that did pretty well. So John would repair the cars and Mildred would do the bookkeeping for the business.
Let me ask you a question, Amy, before you go on into this. Did John voluntarily leave the service or was he discharged and that's why he was adamant that he had to leave?
Oh, Meghan, you just sit tight.
Okay. All right.
But yeah, I mean, I guess after you study enough of these, right, you start to see patterns.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. After this business started, John's mood seemed to improve. And like I said, their business was doing well. Mildred was now a very active member of the community in Tacoma. Her and John, the whole family, they belonged to a community mosque and they developed some very strong friendships. Now, I don't know if she was always Muslim or if she converted at some point after meeting John, but I can tell you that they were both fully devoted to the Muslim community and they were a part of the mosque. The reason I bring that up is because I did mention earlier that Mildred went to church a lot as a child. So at some point between then and now, she did convert. Unfortunately, this stability did not last long. Soon money would go missing, and John often lied to Mildred and continued to be very verbally and emotionally abusive. And I don't think you'll be surprised to find out that she also found out that John had been cheating on her yet again.
Ay.
But although the relationship was abusive and Mildred was suffering greatly, she still wanted to keep this family together, and she believed, or at least hoped, that maybe things would get better. While Mildred was hoping that things would get better for the family, John was ready to call it quits, and he declared that he wanted a divorce from Mildred.
Oh.
Yeah, even though he was the one with the bad behavior, Mildred was trying to stick it out, but John is the one who asked for the divorce. And Mildred was distraught, but at this point she agreed that given all that was going on, perhaps divorce was the best option for them.
Mm-hmm.
But when she told John she would agree to the divorce, what do you think happened?
Well, then he probably, exploded. He was probably, not the reaction he thought, not what he wanted, of course.
Of course not, because now he changed his mind, saying that he was only trying to scare her and that he also wanted to keep the family together. Despite these claims, he continued to cheat on Mildred, and the abuse also continued. But I think finally Mildred had had enough. Even though John was saying he no longer wanted a divorce, she told John he needed to move out of the home. And he tried to get her back, and she refused. She wouldn't even let him in the house. So he started harassing her, and he also cut her and the children off financially, which is problematic given that it was a family business, and that was what the family was relying on.
Ugh.
And things escalated quickly after this, with John showing up at the house randomly, unannounced, sometimes in the middle of the night. There was one event that Mildred describes that she was sleeping in her bed. She awoke to, she said she felt a presence, and she felt someone standing over her. She was able to see his feet. She knew it was John. She pretended she was sleeping. She didn't move, and he eventually left. But now she knew that he was coming into the home at night and just staring at her.
I mean, that's terrifying.
It's frightening. So Mildred says she started to fear him. I don't blame her. And this would only get worse because John said to her, "I am going to kill you if you don't let me back in." So he's now threatening her. And based on this behavior, she felt that this wasn't just a threat, and she was actually scared for her life. So the day after, she got a restraining order. In fact, she got a lifetime protection order that was issued by a judge.
Oh, that's interesting that she got a lifetime protection order. I mean, it's quite serious then.
Yeah, I was surprised by that as well. So I don't know if maybe they had a history of other complaints. I'm not exactly sure.
Right.
Now, through this order, the couple agreed that John would see his kids every other weekend and that a friend would take them back and forth so that Mildred and John would never be face to face.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But things took a turn for the worse on the second weekend of the children's visit with their father. John never returned the children to Mildred as scheduled.
Oh, no. Really?
And to make matters worse, John had drained their joint bank account. Now, this next part is going to infuriate you. So Mildred went to the police to say that her children had been kidnapped, but she was told that because John was the children's father,
it wasn't kidnapping.
Well, that he hadn't violated a formal agreement, as the joint custody plan wasn't yet official. So John absconding with the children was only considered a, quote, custodial interference and not kidnapping.
Yeah, that does infuriate me, but it doesn't surprise me.
And this is so problematic because this meant that she couldn't do anything except wait for John to bring her children back.
That is so terrifying, Amy.
And weeks would pass without her hearing anything from John or her kids.
Weeks. Oh, my God.
Yes. And Mildred contacted anyone and everyone that she thought of who might be able to help her. But unfortunately, there was nothing that could be done legally, and she had no idea where he was with the children. Now, this is before cell phones. Perhaps if it happened today, there would be a Find My Phone, or maybe there would be a way.
Right.
But again, this is the early 90s. Mildred spiraled into a very deep depression. And when the children had been gone for 2 months, Mildred had become so ill that she ended up being hospitalized and needed a blood transfusion.
Oh, my God.
While she was in the hospital, she finally got a call from John.
Oh.
Which is interesting because somehow he knew that she was there.
Yeah.
And this is very concerning given that she had not heard from him in over 2 months, but he was clearly keeping tabs on her somehow.
Right. Wonder if it's through a family. Someone else was keeping tabs, maybe a middle person.
Now, John was not calling to wish Mildred well in her hospital stay. He told her that if she wanted to see the kids again, that she would have to take him back. But she knew that taking him back would mean that he would kill her. So this is her dilemma.
Yeah, of course. But I mean, I would think she would probably have just agreed to anything at that point to see her children.
Yes. Well, remember, John had already threatened Mildred with killing her earlier.
Right.
But this time, he had also called Mildred's mother right before he had called Mildred at the hospital and told Mildred's mother that he had intended to kill Mildred.
Ugh.
So this is an imminent threat at this point.
Yes, yes.
Terrified for her life and the lives of her children, once she got discharged from the hospital, Mildred went to a woman's shelter named Phoebe's house. At this point, nobody knew where John was or when he might show up, so Mildred was forced to change her name, and she was unable to tell anyone that she was hiding at this particular women's shelter. So this poor woman was there, lonely, terrified, wondering if she would ever see her children again.
Terrible story.
But although she was scared, this woman did not remain idle. While in hiding, she hired a PI to find John. She also continued to contact law enforcement about the legality of her children's kidnapping. And check this out, Meghan. She also began studying to become a paralegal, as well as taking classes to get certified as a domestic violence advocate. At this time, she would also take a job working as a legal advocate. So she was doing all of this while working on her own custody case in hopes that her children could be found safe. Because she knew if they were found safe, she would be able to get full legal custody. It was just a matter of finding them, though.
Okay.
What she's doing is incredible.
Yeah.
And I think we can relate to this, right? Being such a badass that if you can't get the help you need, you become certified in what it is that you need.
Yes.
And that's exactly what she did. How cool is that?
Yeah, we've covered a couple stories of people who have done that. Wasn't Sheila Wysocki one of them?
Yes. It's just incredible that, these stories of these women who are going through so much and somehow are able to keep their head straight enough to be, to get all these certifications to just take matters into their own hands.
Right.
During this time, she also got a legal divorce from John. She changed her appearance and she used a new name. And this was all to try to keep John from finding her. And something else was going on interesting at this time. In late 2000, Mildred was informed of a recent ruling in Washington. And this ruling stated that a victim of domestic violence who feared for their life could remove the children from the state without getting permission from the abuser. Again, very promising, but she would need to find her children in order to take advantage of this new legal ruling.
Do you know how long it had been at this point that she'd been separated from them?
It had been almost a year without any word from them at all.
How is he hiding so cleverly? He has to have help because he doesn't have money. I mean, he cleaned out their accounts, but how long can you survive on that with 3 children? So he has to have help, I have to imagine.
Well, you'll find out exactly where he was and how he was able to sustain.
Okay.
In early of 2001, Mildred got word that her mother, who now resided in Maryland with her sister, was very ill and that she needed to help care for her. Now recall that Mildred was taking care of her mother, but obviously, once this all went down, she couldn't care for her elderly mother, so her mother went to Maryland to live with her sister and her sister's husband.
Okay.
So, she gets this call at the shelter. She is still in touch, of course, with her family, and her sister says, I need you to come here. And Mildred felt really torn because, of course, she wanted to help and be with her dying mother, but she was also afraid to leave Washington because she knew that her children could return at any point.
Yeah.
But, staying in Washington, she also felt constantly threatened. There was some evidence that John had figured out where she'd been hiding and he had been stalking her. She says she often felt like she was being watched and people had reported seeing him. So there's some evidence that he found her. So between the fact that she's feeling even more unsafe and her mother's sick, she decides she is going to go to Maryland. So this was a tough decision for her, though. While she was scared that she'd miss her children coming home, she was now with family and she felt really safe because John didn't know her brother-in-law's name or address.
Oh, that's good.
So she felt that, she was staying at a home that was registered to him or his name was on the deed. So she felt that there was no way John would be able to get to her here. Mildred received a call on August 31st, 2001. After 18 months, her children had been found.
Were they okay?
And they were safe. They were safe. It's incredible how they found him because this makes me think that sometimes we don't think law enforcement is doing anything, but we don't always know what's going on behind the scenes.
True. Because
what happened was John's name had been flagged because he attempted to get food stamps. So there was a flag on his name. And the system, things kind of worked. It took a little while, but the kids were safe and they knew where John was now.
That's great.
As Mildred describes in one of her many books, she just started crying and screaming when she got this call, and she hopped on a flight to Tacoma, Washington for an emergency custody hearing where she was finally reunited with her 3 children.
Oh, that's so wonderful. I know the story doesn't end here, though, so okay.
The story's actually kind of just beginning.
Okay. Huh.
I know. You would think at this point maybe we'd be getting to theory and discussion. No, the story hasn't started yet.
Oh, and I still don't know who this is. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Mildred won custody, and she took the children back to Maryland to start their new life with her, leaving a very angry John behind.
Wonderful.
And this was a really hard transition for the kids.
Yeah.
They were angry. They missed their father, and he likely lied to them and made Mildred the villain.
Of course.
But eventually they did settle into their new life in Maryland, and they were all like preteen and teenagers at this point. So that's a hard time to be getting into a whole new environment. Luckily, they made friends, and they were doing well in school, and they were involved in many activities. However, Mildred said she still lived in fear of John.
Mm-hmm.
She was always looking over her shoulder and worried that he would come looking for her and the kids.
Right.
And on top of her trepidation about John, there was also a string of deadly shootings happening in her Maryland neighborhood.
Oh, sorry. I know. I know who it is.
So this is what I mean by the story somewhat is just beginning, because
I just wouldn't have connected the two, but
stories.
now I know who it is.
Okay, so our listeners might as well, but I bet a lot don't. So you keep it to yourself and just stick with me for a few minutes. And I guarantee I'm going to be telling you things you didn't know because I thought I knew.
You already
also.
have. You've already told me a lot I didn't know that wasn't publicized directly with the story. Okay.
In September of 2002, only half a mile from where Mildred and her children lived, a man was shot 6 times outside of his place of employment. A week later, another man was shot and wounded right near Mildred's home. A month later, on October 3rd, yet another man was shot in a nearby Michael's craft store parking lot. And within 2 hours of that shooting, 4 people were randomly shot and killed in a similar location. Of these 4, one was a man cutting the grass at a car dealership. One was a taxi driver filling up his car at a gas station. Another, a woman walking into a post office. And lastly, a woman who was vacuuming her car at a local car wash. Just a few days later, another man was shot and killed just walking down the street. But the most shocking of the shootings occurred on October 7th when a 13-year-old boy was shot outside his middle school. And though he survived, this took the public from terrified to paralyzed by fear. They had a random shooter on their hand that was now targeting children. The absolute randomness of the shootings baffled police, and they had no leads at first. But they did have the fact that all the victims were shot with a single bullet from a far distance. So they knew that they had a sniper on their hands.
I was going to say, the one thing they knew was a sniper.
The media issued a warning to the public to be on the lookout for a white box truck. But despite this warning, the attacks continued, and on October 22nd, a bus driver was shot and killed. In addition to being on the lookout for the box truck, Mildred would also see a suspicious car parked by their home one day. This car was dark-colored, and there were 2 men inside. It's not just Mildred who reported this car. There were many neighbors who said that this car seemed to be surveying Mildred's home on several occasions. Mildred was living in absolute fear of this neighborhood sniper, so she was terribly afraid when someone knocked on her door during dinner on October 23rd of 2002. Mildred opened the door to find an ATF agent named Purvis Smith looking to speak with her. And he had one simple question. When was the last time you spoke to John Muhammad? She told them that the last time they had any contact was on September 4th of 2001, and this was in Washington State when the children were recovered and she was granted custody. But she was confused. She thought, she was wondering, did something happen to John? Of course, she asked the agent, why are you asking me about my ex-husband? And this is when the ATF agent said that they believed that their sniper was her ex-husband, John Muhammad.
Yeah, gosh, I can't even imagine that kind of knock at your door. She probably thought it related to a threat towards herself. She was probably expecting something more personal, but wow, even the shock of this.
Mildred went with the agents to the police station where they asked her about John's history, and then they put Mildred and her children, along with her sister and brother-in-law, into protective custody while the search for John continued. While in a safe place, Mildred and her kids watched the news and learned that John had been apprehended with an accomplice, a 17-year-old named Lee Boyd Malvo.
Yep.
Do you remember how this all went down? So they were sleeping in a car at arrest stop. And this was like a very secretive operation. And, they had cordoned off like the whole area. And it was a sneak attack and they got them.
I do remember that. I also remember how significant this was in the media at the time and watching this kind of unfold. And I remember the fear. I do. I remember the fear. We didn't live in the area, but I still remember people were terrified by this idea. And I think it was the idea that random kids had been shot down. So I remember it.
Yeah, just the randomness of people going about their everyday lives, filling up gas, walking into a craft store. And there was no connection between victims. There wasn't a victimology. There was no characteristics that were seemingly that were connecting these people. So yeah, it was really scary. So Mildred and her children were in complete shock and denial. Meanwhile, Mildred received countless media requests for interviews, which I don't quite understand because if she was in protective custody, I don't know how the media found her, but they found her.
Okay.
Mildred says she learned more about her ex-husband from the news, and she was even more shocked to learn that the order of protection that she had filed for herself and her children had been one of the pieces of evidence that led to John's arrest and finally cracked open the D.C. area sniper case. So apparently there had been a warrant for his arrest because, remember, he had a restraining order. I guess they found out that he owned firearms and he was in possession of firearms. So that's a federal offense.
Right.
So they were able to hold him even if they didn't yet have sufficient evidence that he was in fact the sniper.
Wow.
And Mildred started learning, what was going on when he had those children? Where was he? What was he doing? She learned that John had multiple identities that he used over the years and that when he kidnapped his children, he fled to Antigua.
Oh.
And while in Antigua, he'd been running an illegal business of helping people from the Caribbean to illegally enter the U.S. That's how he made money.
Oh, okay. All right. I thought someone was helping him, but he was making money. Got it. All right.
Yes. And his accomplice, remember Lee Boyd Malvo, the 17-year-old boy, in Antigua is where he met Lee. See, Lee was abandoned by his mother, and John somewhat took him in. So Lee was like a fourth child. He became kind of a older brother figure to the children, and he became John's son.
So I think I always thought Lee Boyd was someone, I thought John was dating someone and Lee Boyd was the son of that person. So I was mistaken. I did not know that.
Yep. I didn't know that either until I did a deep dive. Okay. Media reports would also reveal that John's best friend, Robert Holmes, had called a tip into police during the sniper attacks and told them about John shooting rifles and talking about constructing a silencer. He was also the one who later told Mildred that John knew that her and the kids were in the D.C. area. So Mildred says that Robert saved her life. There's very strong speculation that the intended target of these sniper shootings was Mildred all along. We'll talk more about that at the end. Which I didn't know either until a deep dive.
No idea.
Yeah. And get this, she was also shocked to learn that a murder from about a year prior was connected to John. So one of Mildred's closest, dearest friends had a niece, and her niece was there with her little baby. But this friend was out at the time. While she was there, someone rang the doorbell and then shot her in the head. And at the time, everyone thought it was just a random shooting.
Right.
But it seems as though the friend was being targeted because she was Mildred's best friend.
Oh, my God.
But unfortunately, the niece happened to be there and she ended up dying from her injuries.
Wow.
So Mildred recounts that there's just so many emotions. She felt like no one ever took her seriously when she told them about how dangerous John was. And she felt like all of this could have been prevented if only people had listened to her cries for help, especially after John took the children. Over the 2 months the family was in protective custody, the police contacted Mildred often as they built their case against John. And they were prepping Mildred also to testify against him.
Okay.
The media also continued to hound her for interviews. And something interesting Mildred talks about, her and her children were learning so much more about John from the media than they ever knew before. Remember she said she knew that he had extramarital affairs?
Yes.
Well, from the media, she found out that one of them lasted more than 7 years.
Wow. God, it must be on top of everything, finding out all this information from the media. I always wonder how people are able to survive these stories that go so, I would like to say, viral like this in the whole world. Is what I mean, survive. The whole world knows this, right? And you're finding out this information from the world about your personal life. And it's like tragedy upon tragedy.
And these poor children.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, after there was enough evidence to keep John in jail awaiting his trial, Mildred and her children were allowed to go back home because John was in custody and, their safety was not being threatened at this time. And they tried to resume a normal life as best as they could, but I could imagine that was not easy. John's first trial for one of the victims began in October of 2003. And Mildred was preparing to testify and battling many emotions. She's in shock because of what happened. She's dealing with her own pain from the abuse that she suffered at John's hands. But she also found herself feeling compassion for him because he was the father of her children. So there's a lot of conflicting emotions happening.
Sure.
During the trial is when prosecutors claim that John's motive in the killings were all aimed at eventually killing Mildred. So basically that when he got to her, it would just appear to be another shooting so that nobody would suspect her estranged husband.
I didn't know that.
And again, this might just be the prosecution's theory, but I think it makes a lot of sense given what we now know.
Are you also going to talk at all about how he recruited Lee Boyd?
Yeah, it's a very sad story. And obviously the story of Lee Boyd deserves its own episode. There's so much information here, but I can tell you just succinctly that he was pretty much groomed. Lee Boyd, Malvo, had no family, no one to care for him, and John became a father figure. And I'm not saying that Lee Boyd should not be blamed at all for his actions, but, it does seem like he was manipulated and coerced.
I'm sure he was manipulated, coerced. I wonder what story John sold him. You know what I mean? Did he know always that this was some revenge story, or was there another we should get back at society for the wrongs they've done to us kind of story?
Yep, it was more from what Lee Boyd Malvo has said, that he never said this was all aimed at Mildred, although he did admit that they were stalking Mildred and eventually probably something was going to happen to Mildred. But he says that it all had to do with getting back at society, all these grand stories about the issues in society. I'm sure a lot of it stemmed from his time in the military and some ideas he had.
Right.
So Mildred, although she was worried to testify, she was very nervous. She finally felt seen and thought that people would finally understand her level of victimization because she felt that people blamed her. She thinks, had she not asked for enough help? Was she not loud enough? If she had done more to alert others that he was a troubled and dangerous man, could all these lives had been saved? Obviously, this was not at all her fault, and the burden should not be on her, but it's sad that she was having these feelings.
Of course.
So Mildred ended up not having to testify, and this would be because John was never physically abusive with Mildred, so the prosecution didn't think that her testimony of mental and emotional abuse and his threats would help their case, which I think is absurd. That's this misconception that if a woman doesn't have physical marks, then the abuse isn't a problem.
I know.
So I think she was partially relieved because she was nervous about it. But again, she still felt like, no one was taking it seriously. A Virginia court found John guilty of capital murder, conspiracy, and firearms charges. He faced the death penalty, and Mildred was asked to testify during the sentencing phase. So we've talked about this in other episodes, but in most states that have a death penalty, you have a bifurcated trial where you have the guilt phase and the penalty phase. Now, the prosecution did not ask Mildred to testify in the guilt phase, but she was being called to testify in the sentencing phase. And he was ultimately sentenced to death. I don't think that's surprising to anyone, given the amount of people that were terrorized and murdered. I found it interesting that Mildred also testified in Lee Boyd Malvo's sentencing phase, and this was for the defense. And she was trying to explain how manipulative John was.
I see.
I think that's really big of her to do. I think she saw this young boy who kind of got caught up with this man, and she felt some compassion for him.
Well, Amy, also, we always say that victims and offenders can be one and the same. So it sounds like Lee Boyd was probably a victim himself and an offender. So there is some, I guess, compassion for him also being a younger, almost child,
And there would be many other court proceedings as the murders spanned several states. So John, after his death sentence, he was extradited to Maryland, and he was convicted of 6 additional counts. Then he was sent back to Virginia, but he also faced charges in 3 other states as well. As I said, each player in this could be its own episode. Right. There's a lot of legal stuff going on.
Yeah.
Now, John denied his involvement, saying that he did not do anything, and that since no one had ever seen him kill anyone, they can't say he did anything. But, I mean, the evidence is overwhelming, and there was no shred of doubt, really, in anyone's mind. It was very clear that he and Lee were the shooters. With the trial concluded, John was locked away for good, and Mildred moved on with her life the best that she could. And Mildred would try to move on with her life the best she could. She accepted a position as an administrative assistant for the PA Coalition Against Domestic Violence. She felt that it was her life mission now to help others who found themselves in similar domestic violence situations. Unfortunately, not long after she started, though, the coalition faced funding issues and they had to close their DC headquarters. But this did not stop Mildred. She decided she would start her own organization. The organization was called After the Trauma, and it was created to assist survivors of domestic violence in reestablishing their lives. Mildred said she was frustrated at the lack of assistance that she received, especially, again, given that her abuse wasn't physical. So her goal was to provide assistance to those who were facing non-physical abuse. Although it would take a while to get her organization off the ground, and from what I could find, it's no longer active. So I don't know if it never got off the ground or if it did, but then it closed.
Oh.
But Mildred is still doing a lot of work in this area.
Oh, good.
She started getting offered many speaking engagements around the country, and she became a national spokesperson for domestic violence. She is an advocate, and she accompanies survivors and victims to court. She also connects survivors to needed resources.
Victim advocate.
In 2009, she published her first memoir, Scared Silent, When the One You Love Becomes the One You Fear.
Oh.
And that was one of the primary sources for today's episode.
Okay.
She went on to publish several other books as well, and I'll probably read them all. Maybe we could do one for an upcoming Patreon book club.
I was going to say that.
She had a second memoir called I'm Still Standing, Crawling Out of the Darkness into the Light. She also published something called The Survivor's Journey from Victim to Survivor.
Nice.
The list goes on and on.
Wow.
She's also co-authored several books. Her most recent book, which I've not gotten my hands on yet, was released in 2022, and it's called In the Midst of Chaos.
I wonder if writing was a passion of hers before all this, and she just found like an outlet now or a story to tell. So interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. In her book, she never talked about it being a passion. It almost sounded like the issues were the passion, and then the writing became a way for her to express. But she's a good writer. These books are really well written. In the past decade, Mildred has received many awards, and she is also a global keynote speaker. She is an international expert for the U.S. Department of State. She's a consultant with the U.S. Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime, and the list goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
And after all that she endured, this is so inspiring.
Yes, it
is. So you
is.
should check out what she's doing on her website, which will be linked in our show notes.
Wonderful.
Now, the story on its own would be compelling, given what Mildred had endured and then accomplished. But what drew me to this story was how little I knew about Mildred. I had heard a ton about the DC sniper attacks, and we teach about the DC sniper attacks. But getting to dive deeply into Mildred's personal story was so eye-opening.
This one for me was so interesting. And yeah, like, wow. I don't know that I'd ever even heard her name.
I don't believe I did. I certainly heard of the two snipers.
Yes. Well, just so you know, when you said, I bet you $1 million you know who it is, I didn't say anything back. So it wasn't an official bet. Sorry.
Okay, good. So, it's okay. Next time we'll shake on it.
All right.
I want to turn to John for a minute to see if we can theorize what was going on with him.
Sure.
And also, just to give a little background for our listeners on the DC sniper attacks. I highly, highly suggest checking out the podcast Monster DC Sniper podcast. It is absolutely incredible, and it covers every aspect of the DC snipers. But for those of you who were not born yet or who just don't recall, they were also known as the Beltway sniper attacks, and they were a series of coordinated shootings that occurred during 3 weeks in October of 2002. And this would be throughout the Washington metropolitan area, consisting of the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia. It would also come to find out that there were preliminary shootings and several murders and robberies in other states that lasted for 6 months starting in February of 2002. Overall, 7 people were killed, 7 others were injured in the preliminary shootings, and then 10 people were killed and 3 were critically wounded in the October shootings. In total, John and his accomplice killed 17 people and wounded 10 others in a 10-month span.
Unbelievable.
The frequency of the killings and the randomness of the victims suggests a standard spree killer, but also confining activity to one geographic area and premeditating the slayings also jibe with serial killer definition, especially given that we found out about these preliminary murders. Do you agree? This can kind of skirt both definitions.
Yes, I teach it primarily under the umbrella of serial killing.
You do?
I do.
And I teach it under spree because there's much fewer examples of spree killings.
Yeah, that's true.
Interesting.
But I teach a course on serial killers, so I guess maybe I just I lean that way, more at my orientation, just because it was over a significant period of time. And yes, there were multiple victims in sometimes shorter time frames, but there was also multiple victims over longer time frames as well. So yeah, it could fall under either.
Yes.
You're right. The categorization you give is correct.
Because spree killers is typically a shorter time than 3 weeks.
Yes.
It would be like within a few hours.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. I think it's very clear that John suffered from untreated mental illness, and there was a whole host of issues that led John to these behaviors. But we can't know for sure. I'm not sure if he was ever even diagnosed officially with anything.
Why was he discharged from the service? Do you know?
There seems to be reports that he was angry and threatening to others around him.
I had a feeling that's where you're going. So I was going to say.
You called it.
Yeah, I knew, I had a feeling he was discharged, and then I had a feeling it was related to trouble controlling his temper. So that makes perfect sense to me as well. But, he's got anger, he's got a temper, he's got control issues. So, all of these things, don't bode very well.
I think life course theory is probably good to look at John, because there's a series of events throughout his life that kind of gets him to this last big crime that he committed.
And it seems like things sort of, at times he's got stronger social bonds than other. He's got stabilizing events, but then losing a job, losing a wife. These are destabilizing events that trigger temper and control issues. So coupling this also with a personality disorder or untreated mental illness, he's a perfect storm, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think I don't usually spend too much time talking about him in my theory class, but almost every theory, it's like you could touch on almost every theory when trying to understand him.
Yeah.
Before we close out for today, I think it's important to underscore how the system failed Mildred.
Yes.
She tried to get help many, many times, especially when John kidnapped her children, but she says she wasn't taken seriously. And even many people in her life didn't take action when she told them that John was going to kill her. No one thought the threat was serious. The policy in her state had eventually caught up, but it was almost too little too late.
Right.
But I am glad to see that policy does exist.
Yes.
But unfortunately, as we see sometimes with policies, if only that policy was in place, and a lot of these things could have been prevented.
Right.
So I think the take-home message here is that domestic violence victims need to be listened to, and they need to be protected.
We have come a long way with domestic violence. So I don't want to underscore the resources, but it's one of those issues where you see there's so much more to do. And every time you make a little progress, you realize, we didn't acknowledge there's certain victims that we're still not acknowledging or we're still not protecting. So, but there are a lot of resources, and I think I would bet you're going to talk about some of the things or some of the resources that we know that are available that can really help victims.
Yes, we've listed these before in other episodes, but I think it's important to put it out here again that if you or someone you know is in crisis and needs help in a domestic violence situation, you can contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And this is 24/7 for free at 1-800-799-7233. You can also go online to www.thehotline.org. And here there's anonymous, confidential support as well, available in both English and Spanish. Individual states also have a lot of resources available as well.
Right.
And it's important to note that advocates at the National Domestic Violence Hotline, they field calls from both survivors of domestic abuse as well as individuals who are concerned that they might be abusive towards their partners. And I was not aware of that.
That's excellent.
Yeah, isn't that so? Somebody who's feeling like, maybe they're out of control and they don't know how they can, help themselves. So I think that's great that we're looking at this a little more holistic than we used to.
Yes, I agree 100%. And I didn't know that either. I think that's great. I did not know that. I love to hear this more holistic approach. I'm sorry that these resources were not available to someone like Mildred, because when you hear stories like this, you go, what we have now, and if times were different, right? But her story, her memoir, everything that she's doing, she helps move the ball forward. She helps make it better for the next generation of victims. And that's really the best that, anyone can do. And so it's amazing that she becomes part of the solution. And she goes from victim to survivor to influencer to advocate. And that is the transformation. So it does give me, chills in that regard. And it makes me happy for people who are going to face these issues, that there are women like Mildred to help push them through.
That's true. And like I mentioned, there's a lot of resources on Mildred's website for people who need help kind of moving to that next step. And Mildred talks not only about her experiences, but she provides actual practical guidelines of what people can do if they find themselves in these situations. So you should check out her website at mildredmuhammad.com. That will also be linked in our show notes as well.
Well, Amy, I just want to say thank you for today's case. So fascinating to learn the story behind the story of this one, just when you think you know something. Thank you for that.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you all so much for listening today, and we will catch you next time on Women in Crime.
Women in Crime is written and hosted by Meghan Sachs and Amy Shlosberg. Our producer is James Varga. Script editing is by Abagail Belcastro. Audio editing is by Siler Burr and Jose Alfonzo. And music is by Desert Media. If you enjoy the show, please remember to follow and leave a review. You can also support the show through Patreon, where you can get access to additional ad-free content such as exclusive full-length episodes, lectures, a book club, and virtual happy hours with Meghan and Amy. For more information, visit patreon.com/womenandcrime.
Sources for today's episode include the podcast Monster, the DC Sniper podcast, MildredMuhammad.com, The Washington Post, Essence.com, CNN, and Scared Silence, written by Mildred Muhammad.